Some of the wives who feel the most unheard in their marriages are actually communicating all the time. They're explaining and clarifying and bringing things up as they come. They're trying to have healthy conversations, and yet they still end up feeling unheard and alone. If you've ever thought, why do I keep having to repeat myself? Or does he even care how I feel? Then I want you to know that you're not alone. Feeling unheard is painful because underneath that is usually a deeper fear. If he doesn't understand me or how I feel, then how are we going to feel close? And here's what I've noticed after working with so many wives. The harder we try to get our husbands to understand us, the more disconnected we often end up feeling. And I know that sounds backwards, but by the end of this episode, you'll understand why that happens and what creates connection instead. Because what if the problem isn't that you're not explaining yourself well enough, but what if actually there's just another way to do it that will actually help you to feel heard and feel like you're on the same team? Welcome to the Softening into Love podcast. I'm your host, relationship coach Laura Amador, and I'm so glad that you're here. Let's start with softening in real time. This is where I share a little bit about my own marriage and how I'm choosing to soften into love each week. So, this topic of feeling unheard has been especially meaningful to me lately because I've had a really beautiful experience around something that used to be a source of tension in my own marriage. One area where my husband and I saw things differently was finances. I had a very strong desire to be completely debt free because to me it represented freedom and peace and security and the ability to create a different kind of future for our family. My husband, on the other hand, didn't see debt the same way I did. His perspective was more practical. He felt that having some debt wasn't necessarily the end of the world or a huge problem, and it wasn't something that we needed to rush to eliminate right away. And so for a long time, I felt misunderstood around this, and I felt unheard, and sometimes even felt like he didn't care that it stressed me out. And so I felt like he didn't fully understand why it mattered to me so much. What I can see now is that I spent a lot of time focusing on what I didn't want. I talk about how much I hated debt and how frustrated I felt about it and why I wanted it gone. And what would happen was that he would respond with his own perspective, and then I'd respond again with mine. And so before I knew it, we weren't really sharing our hearts, we were sharing competing viewpoints. Now, neither of us was all right or all wrong. We just kept meeting each other with logic and therefore missing each other. And so several years ago, I made a decision that changed so much in our marriage. I decided that my marriage mattered more to me than getting everything done my way or on my timeline. That didn't mean giving up on my desires, but it did mean relinquishing control. It meant trusting that I didn't have to force every outcome. And so over the years, I've done a lot of work around self care and respect, receiving, expressing my desires, and allowing my husband to be fully himself. And honestly, I found a lot of unexpected peace and calm and security in this and got to see him really step up and how he really takes incredible care of us. And so I felt good. And so more recently, I started thinking again about our future and the legacy that we wanted to leave behind. But this time, instead of talking about what I didn't want, I shared what I did want. I told him I'd love to be debt free. And then I painted a picture and I shared my vision, what it would feel like and what it would mean for our family, what it would mean for our future and for the legacy that we're building together. And something surprising and amazing happened. He was completely on board, not reluctantly or because I convinced him or wore him down with my logic, but because he genuinely shared in the vision with me. And I found myself feeling something that was even better than getting my way and winning, right? I felt supported, I felt partnered with, and I felt really heard. And so now we're working towards this goal together. And I feel like it's a really exciting time in our relationship because this has become something that is strengthening our teamwork rather than creating tension between us because it's a shared goal. It's like we're on this fun adventure together. And what struck me is how different this feels from years ago when I was trying to fix everything at once. I wanted to improve the marriage and improve our finances and improve our parenting and redecorate the house, right? I wanted to improve all the things. And in trying to control so much, I wasn't creating the connection I wanted. What I've learned is that when I put the marriage first, so many other things begin to fall into place. And I've seen this happen over and over again. The places that once felt like our biggest disagreements have often become our greatest opportunities for teamwork, growth, and connection. And I think that's the lesson I'm taking with me from this week. Sometimes what we're longing for isn't actually getting him to see our side, it's connection and partnership and this deep understanding that comes from that. Sometimes feeling heard doesn't come from arguing our point more effectively. It comes from sharing our desires more vulnerably and more openly. And sometimes the thing we've been pushing against the hardest is the very thing that softens when we finally stop trying to force it. There's a phrase I come back to often: what I resist persists. And I found that to be true in so many areas of my marriage. The more that I tried to control, the more stuck that I felt. The more I softened, trusted, and focused on connection, the more space there was for us to become a team and to actually enjoy each other and enjoy the journey. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about today as we dive into what it really means to feel heard in your marriage. A woman once told me, I don't even bring things up anymore. I've told him how I feel 100 times and it makes no difference. So what's the point? This woman was far from happy. She was lonely and frustrated. But the thing was, she still wanted connection. She wanted to feel known and she wanted to feel heard and cared for and supported. And she wanted to believe that her husband cared about what was happening in her heart and that they were a team. And she didn't know how to keep trying without feeling hurt and disappointed. If you've ever stopped sharing how you feel because feeling unheard hurts too much, you're in the right place. When conversations feel one sided or flat, it hurts because it touches on our feelings of belonging and emotional safety and intimacy. I remember speaking with a wife who said that she'd started planning her conversations in her head in advance, like a presentation. She would rehearse how to bring things up, how to word them, and even how to respond if he reacted a certain way. But instead of feeling more connected and heard and understood, she felt more exhausted. And still, she'd end the conversation thinking, he still didn't hear me. This is where so many wives get stuck. The more unheard that they feel, the more they try to be understood. And the more that they try, the more pressure the conversation begins to carry. The truth is, we cannot control anybody but ourselves. At the same time, with the right skills, you can set a new tone in your marriage where you can inspire him to lean in instead of out so that you can actually feel heard and cared for and supported. So let's look at what actually helps shift this dynamic. When you feel unheard, it's natural to try harder. Most women don't realize that some of the most common communication habits actually increase distance instead of connection. One of the biggest mistakes when trying to feel heard that wives make is over explaining. When you feel misunderstood, you naturally try to clarify. You might add more details, more reasoning, more context. But often, what he hears is pressure rather than clarity. And so, a lot of times, saying less is actually more if what you want is to feel seen and cared for and supported. Another common pattern is to try to convince him or get him to see and understand your perspective. When something matters deeply, it can turn into a case that you're building instead of a feeling that you're sharing. A third mistake is escalating emotionally when you feel dismissed and unheard. It's natural because you want to finally be understood, but unfortunately, intensity often leads to a shutdown, not closeness. And perhaps the most painful mistake or pattern is silently building resentment. On the outside, maybe you're talking and trying to keep it together, but internally, you're carrying this deep frustration that slowly leaks into your tone and timing and interpretation. I once worked with a woman who said, I didn't realize I was entering every conversation like I was already braced for disappointment. I thought I was just explaining myself, but I was actually trying to get him to finally get it. Now, these patterns are often protective strategies, but they rarely create the emotional outcome that you're longing for. The good news is that there's another way to approach these moments that creates more connection with far less effort. The first is to fill your cup first so that you can show up grounded. One of the most overlooked pieces of communication is your internal state before the conversation even begins. When you're depleted, overwhelmed, or emotionally stretched thin, everything feels more charged. Some moments feel bigger or more urgent, and neutral responses might feel like a rejection. Silence feels like distance. it can make things feel so much more personal and negative. I once worked with a mother of three who told me that she tried to talk to her husband at the end of the day after handling everything for everyone else. She would start calm, but within minutes, she felt herself getting frustrated and feeling unheard. What she eventually realized was that she wasn't actually starting those conversations from a grounded place. She was starting them from emotional depletion. When you begin to take care of yourself first, even in small ways, you change the emotional tone that you bring into the relationship. You're less likely to pursue understanding in a way that feels urgent or intense, and instead, you're more able to express yourself clearly and calmly. This might look like a short walk, or some quiet time alone, or journaling, or anything that helps you return to yourself before you engage. This is giving your nervous system enough space so that you're not trying to get emotional regulation from your husband in the middle of a hard moment. Instead, you're approaching from a grounded and calm and competent place. The second step is to get clear on your desire and to express it. Many wives become incredibly skilled at explaining what's wrong. Fewer feel confident expressing what they actually want. When you feel unheard, it's natural to focus on the problems. You notice what's missing, what's not working, and what you wish would change. But there's a powerful shift that happens when you move from explanation from a place of lack to desire from a place of abundance. Instead of trying to convince or persuade, you simply share what you would love. For example, if saying, the oven barely works and we really need a new one, you might say, I would love a new oven. There was a woman I worked with who realized she was spending most of her conversations trying to get her husband to understand why things matter to her so much. She was explaining, justifying, and building a case. When she began practicing the shift, she said something very simple one evening. She just said, I would love to send our child to private school. No trying to explain or build a case or prove to him that this was the best choice for their family. She simply stated her desire. And he was actually able to hear it because he wasn't feeling concerned or forced to agree. He simply understood what would make her happy and wanted her to have it. Tip three is to be vulnerable without unintentionally criticizing. One of the most common patterns I see in struggling communication is the blending of vulnerability with subtle criticism. It's understandable when you feel hurt, your words often carry that hurt with it. But how something is said changes what it creates in the relationship. For example, saying, you never want to spend time with me anymore might be an honest reflection of your feelings, but it often lands as blame. A more vulnerable expression might sound like simply saying, I miss you. I once heard a wife describe a moment where she finally shifted how she spoke during a tense conversation. And instead of listing everything that felt wrong, she simply said, I've missed you lately. She told me that she expected defensiveness from him because that had been their common way of communicating. But instead, there was a pause and a softening. And then a very different kind of conversation followed as he took her hands and brought her into his arms. Another woman had tried telling her husband that she wanted him to help her more with driving the kids to their various sports activities when he was home on the weekends. She was frustrated because instead of taking initiative, he just waited around for her to tell him exactly what to do. So it felt easier for her to just keep doing it. When she was finally vulnerable and simply said to him, I can't drive the kids to the sports on weekends anymore, he simply said, okay, and made a plan with the kids, and she was relieved to have that off her plate. The simple shift from telling him what to do to the vulnerable truth that she just couldn't do it anymore without accusing or blaming created the opportunity for him to step up as her hero and spend more time with the kids. Vulnerability invites connection because it reveals your heart without assigning fault. It's really about expressing your experience in a way that keeps emotional safety intact. Tip number four is to focus on connection before solutions. When you feel unheard, it's easy to focus on getting resolution. You want understanding, agreement, and of course, a change. This is much easier to achieve when you're both on the same team and both feeling heard. One of the simplest and most powerful phrases you can begin using is, I hear you. These three words communicate something deeply important. They signal that you're not just waiting for your turn to speak or that what he thinks isn't right or isn't good enough. You're actually listening and saying that what he thinks has merit. I once spoke with a woman who said that she started saying, I hear you in conversations with her husband, where she normally would have defended herself or felt the need to explain or set the record straight. She told me something unexpected happened. Their conversations became much softer and more connecting. She wasn't trying to get him to see her side anymore. She was simply trying to stay connected in the moment. And she found that it wasn't long before her husband started to mirror her by deeply listening. And this became the new culture of their conversations. When both people feel heard, defensiveness naturally begins to soften. And from that place, real solutions become so much more possible. Tip 5 is to journal to understand yourself more deeply. It's really easy to know what we don't want. It's another thing to know what we do want. One woman told me that every year she dreaded her in laws' visits. They would come and stay over every year for 2 weeks, during which she felt stressed and under pressure to please them and to be the perfect hostess. She felt unheard by her husband because every year she told him how much this stressed her out, and they would end up in an argument about it. When I asked her about what she wanted, she said she actually didn't really know. And so, after taking a few days to think about it, she shared with me that she wanted to receive their offers to babysit and to take a night off with her husband. She wanted to go for long solo walks in the morning, and she wanted to enjoy connection with her in laws by taking her mother in law shopping, cooking simpler meals, and even hiring some cleaning help so it didn't all fall on her. Once she expressed these desires to her husband, he was more than happy to support her with her desires. She felt heard and loved. Often, the reason you feel unheard isn't actually because your husband doesn't care, but because you're still discovering what it is that you truly desire and need. Journaling creates space for clarity. When you slow down and write your thoughts without interruption, you begin to understand what's actually underneath the frustration. You might discover that what you thought was anger was actually loneliness, or what felt like irritation is actually a longing for more connection and affection or time for self care. There was a woman who told me she started journaling every day for just 10 minutes. And at first, she wrote about everything her husband was not doing and what he was doing wrong. But over time, her writing shifted. She began to notice patterns in her emotions and desires. Eventually, she said to me, I knew what I didn't want, but I didn't know what I wanted. I just knew that I was upset. That clarity of knowing her desires changed how she communicated and how her husband was able to show up and support her. Suddenly, he wanted to hear because he felt like he could win. The better you understand yourself, the easier it becomes to express yourself without overwhelm or confusion. Your husband doesn't have to guess what you desire or feel like he's constantly failing to meet your expectations that he can't see. Clarity can create connection. One thing I wish every wife knew is this: feeling unheard isn't necessarily a sign that your husband doesn't care. It's often a sign that you've been carrying your heart in a way that he can't fully see. So many women believe that if they can just explain themselves clearly enough, calmly enough, and just one more time, then finally their husband will understand. And I know because I've been there too. But what I've noticed is that the harder we work to be understood, the easier it is to actually hide the very thing that we want someone to see. We hide our longing behind frustration. We hide our hurt behind criticism. We hide our desires behind expectations and justifications. We hide our loneliness behind control. And after a while, we start believing that feeling heard and understood comes from getting our point across just right. But connection doesn't come from being right. Connection comes from being known. Those are two very different things. Being right says, see things my way. Being knows says, let me show you my heart. And one of the most beautiful things I've witnessed, both in my own life and in the lives of the women that I work with, is that marriages often begin to change when a wife stops focusing on how to make herself understood and starts focusing on how to reveal her heart. Instead of proving why she's upset, she shares what she desires and longs for. Instead of explaining why she's frustrated, she shares vulnerably. Instead of trying to control the outcome, she allows herself to be seen. Because underneath almost every complaint is a desire. And underneath almost every frustration is longing. Underneath almost every "you're not hearing me" is the quieter truth: I miss you. I want to feel close to you. I think many wives spend years trying to be understood when what their hearts are really craving is connection. And connection rarely begins with better arguments. It begins with courage, the courage to let yourself be fully known. Now, this week's experiment that I'd love to invite you to is very simple. For the next 7 days, notice every time you're about to explain, convince, justify, or make a case for something with your husband. So just notice it and then pause and ask yourself, what's the desire under this? What am I actually longing for right now? Maybe it's that you miss him. Maybe you'd love a clean kitchen. Maybe you'd love more time to do self care. Maybe you'd love help putting the kids to bed. Once you've identified how you feel and what you'd love and the desire, see if you can express it in one simple sentence that begins with, I would love. And that's it. No explanation, no supporting evidence, no convincing or follow up argument, just your desire. The goal of this experiment is not to get a particular response from your husband. The goal is to practice sharing your desires and your heart more directly and more vulnerably with less pressure. You might be surprised by how different that feels. And you might discover that expressing a desire feels much more vulnerable than explaining a problem. And that's okay. We're not aiming for perfection this week. We're simply becoming more aware of the difference between trying to be understood and allowing ourselves to be known. I'd love to invite you to pay attention to what you notice. How did it feel? What came up for you? And what did you learn about yourself? Because sometimes the smallest shifts create the biggest changes in our connection. And please feel free to share in the comments how this went for you. Now, if today's episode resonated with you and you're realizing that feeling heard isn't just about communication, but about creating more connection in your marriage, I have a free guide that can help. It's called 3 Steps to Reignite Connection, and it's designed to help you begin creating more closeness, warmth, and emotional intimacy without feeling like you have to work harder or carry everything yourself. You'll find the link to that in the description. And if you're listening and thinking, I understand this, but applying it in my own marriage feels harder than it sounds, I completely understand. And that's exactly why I do the work I do. If you'd like more personalized support, you'll also find the information about working with me one-on-one in the description. Now, for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about resentment. We all know how damaging resentment to a relationship can be, but what many people don't know is what to do about it and how to overcome it in an empowering way that makes you feel good and the relationship feel good. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm cheering you on, and until next time, keep softening into love.